everybody from southwest France, where it's been rather cold today. I don't know what it's like with you, and wet. So it's a real pleasure to have Elaine Howard-Ecklund from Rice University, our third speaker in the last few months from Rice University. We've had Jeff Kreipel and April DeConnick, her colleagues in the Department of Religion. And she's going to be talking about her book and the studies that she's been doing. This is the name of the book here, Secularity and Science, which I think is a groundbreaking book in looking at the cross-cultural aspects of this relationship between science and religion. And so quite a number of countries are involved, as I'm sure Elaine will explain. And of course, that means that the situation in each country is unique because of its cultural heritage. So speaking from France, for instance, there is the strongest two motifs, if you like, of Catholicism and atheism. There's not much agnosticism in France. It's usually either you're Catholic and pretty religious or you're atheistic. And I remember an occasion when I had Jacques Benveniste, the scientist, speaking at Mystics and Scientists, and he told me that his children had been raised as good atheists, de bons athées, he said. Just by way of thematic introduction, I see there are a number of different interfaces in this area, some of which we look at more closely than others. And so I see these are the interfaces with science I'm talking about. So you have the interface between science and religion, and that can be Islam or Hinduism or Christianity. Then you have another interface specifically between science and Christian theology, which is the domain of the Science and Religion Forum founded by Arthur Peacock in the UK, and also Christians in Science. And the Faraday Institute at Cambridge and the Ian Ramsey Institute at Oxford are largely the Christian theology slash science. Then you have the interface between science and spirituality, then science and mysticism, which is represented by the Mystics and Scientists Conference that we put on and have done since 1978. And then the other interface that I sometimes mention is the science esotericism or the science gnosis interface. And this is so all these interfaces are different and equally interesting. But I think it's worth thinking about exactly what you're talking about and what the scope is of what you're talking about. And so this evening we've got one of the world's experts on the field, who's professor in the social sciences department at Rice University, as I was saying. And if you go to her website later, which is ElaineHowardEcklund.com, you can learn about her research, looking at the interviews that she's been doing. And her current research is with John H. Evans at University of California, San Diego, and they have a 2.9 million grant to create a new subfield of sociological research, examining how identities and beliefs are related to attitudes about science and religion. I think that's fascinating, and I really look forward to hearing about the results of that. And she's been funded by the Templeton Religion Trust, the John Templeton Foundation, and many other National Science Foundation. So she's had a wide range of grants. And her latest book is called Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, 8 Shared Values That Move Us Beyond Fear. I don't know whether you're going to be talking about that at all, Elaine, but I look forward to seeing that book. And also, I think it's very important that you're looking into the question of religion, ethics, and gender, because this is a huge, hugely important theme in this field. So, very warm welcome to you, and we're really looking forward to what you have to share with us this evening. Over to you, Elaine.
Thank you, David. Thank you so much and Andrew for having me. I am going to share my screen. We'll see if it looks like, is that okay? Can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay, very good. Well, I have been spending about the past 15 years studying what scientists think about religion and what religious people think about science. And I come at these topics a little bit differently than some others. So the field of science and religion is a very active subfield of history and philosophy, and as David mentioned, theology for sure. It is not as much of a vibrant subfield in the social sciences nor in my own field of sociology. And I think sociology has something very special and distinctive to bring to the study of science and religion and the science-religion interface, because we look at everyday people and what they actually do. So generally we think of science and faith and science and spirituality as sets of ideas. And we think a lot about the ways in which these ideas intersect with one another in productive or unproductive ways. But as a sociologist, I'm more concerned with the social distribution of things called science and things called religion, and the kind of impact and difference that that makes in the real social world. So I want to talk today specifically about a study that I have been conducting with a team at Rice University through the Religion and Public Life program over the past 10 years. And the culmination of that study is to be found in this book, Secularity and Science, What Scientists Around the World Really Think About Religion. This is the press's title. It's probably more aptly called What Scientists in 8 Specific Country Contexts Think About Religion. We didn't study all of the world, but we did study 8 country contexts, and I will talk to you about that in a moment. This was a very large project where we sent out over 40,000 surveys and did over 600 in-depth interviews. And the book has several authors. So I was the main principal investigator for this project, but David Johnson, Brandon Vajanathan, Kirsten Matthews, Stephen Lewis, Robert Thompson, and Dee Dee are very much co-authors of this particular book, which was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. So religion is an incredibly important phenomenon in the real world, whether we like it or not. So some people see that positively and some people see that negatively, but it just is. 5.8 billion individuals, or nearly 85% of the global population, is religious to some extent. And the other 15%, many of them are spiritual, some non-religious. Complete non-religion is somewhat of a modern phenomenon, but still the modal social distribution is to be religious rather than to not be religious. Science is incredibly important as well. So the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimates that in 2015, which is their most recent study of this, the global science and engineering workforce in OECD countries was 4.8 million. So religion is more numerous than science is, but science is incredibly important in the social world. So it's commonplace knowledge that any national context which is trying to grow its economic infrastructure is also trying to grow its science and technology infrastructure. So science and monetary growth are very much, and development growth are very much interconnected. The science and faith interface as well lives large in the public imagination around the world. So we see a lot of very public examples of this. In the UK, of course, Richard Dawkins, very well known for his scientific work, but it's really broken onto the global stage through his public work about the science and religion interface, especially his book, The God Delusion, which stayed on the New York Times bestseller list for a long period of time. That's published in 2005. We have also Francis Collins, who's the US director of the National Institutes of Health, head of the Human Genome Project, who also argues that science and his own evangelical Christian faith are completely compatible. Dawkins, of course, argues that religion is not necessarily a good thing for society and is a very specific kind of atheist scientist. We also see that the religion and science interface is played out politically. This is something that's talked about a lot right now especially in the US as we're developing vaccination efforts related to the pandemic. So whether or not we like it, science and faith interface lives large in the public imagination around the world. And we need to study the world to understand it, and particularly scientists. Science and religion have an impact on other kinds of social phenomenon as well. So I want to make 5 big points in this talk. So firstly, that around the world, there are indeed religious scientists. May not come as a surprise to some on this call, but I think that is something that many in the general population do not think exists. That when I do studies of the general population in the US and the UK, there's still a widespread sentiment that scientists cannot be religious. Second, that atheist scientists are more varied than we might think. Third, that most scientists do not see religion and science as conflicting. Fourth, that religion comes up in various ways and in very specific ways in the scientific workforce. And 5, I want to talk specifically about my own US for a moment. I think that in the US in particular, religion may be part of increasing racial and gender diversity in science. So 5 big points. First, a little bit about the methods of the study that formed the basis for secularity in science. So we studied 8 national and regional contexts: the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Turkey, India, Hong Kong, and Taiwan. Those are national contexts that have different levels of scientific infrastructure. They are also national contexts where there are scientists, so a large enough group of scientists working in research institutes and universities to do a survey of scientists. They are national contexts that have different relationships between religion and the state, and where the religiosity of the general population is different across the national context, and they are from different regions of the globe. Obviously, there are pieces of the globe that are notably missing. And so we can have lots of follow-up questions if you're interested in that, about why we chose these national contexts and where we plan to study next. We looked at all of the subfields of 2 scientific disciplines, biology and physics. We chose those disciplines because they are present in most places where there is any scientific infrastructure. There are also disciplines that have a different history of the relationship between science and religion. And they are disciplines where there are different proportions of women in particular, and gender and religion are often very much related. We started with an enormous list of scientists. So our team at Rice University in the Religion and Public Life program put together that entire list from scratch. There is not a good comprehensive existing list of scientists through looking at websites and departments and through an elaborate sampling procedure. It took us over a year with people working 40 hours a week to put together that list. So that was an incredibly labor-intensive procedure. We then took a random sample of 22,525 scientists. We oversampled in some areas, meaning we took more into our sample than would be present in the general population according to gender and some other kinds of characteristics. We had a response of 9,422 survey respondents, from about 35% in some of the national contexts to nearly 60% in some of the others. Then we took another sample of those who responded to the survey based on religiosity, and we did 609 in-depth interviews. Those were conducted in 8 different languages, and then we back translated them. So we transcribed them in the original language and then translated them to English so that everyone in our team could analyze them. So first, a very basic point, that around the world, there are more religious scientists than we might think. So here are the national contexts. The scientists are in blue. So in terms of the lower end of the proportion, France, of the national context that we studied, has the lowest proportion of scientists who see themselves as religious. So 16% in France, 27% in the UK, 30% of scientists in the US, and 39% in Hong Kong. In Italy, Taiwan, Turkey, and India, the proportion goes up quite a bit. And in the general population, in most places in the general population, the proportion of scientists who are religious is a good deal less than the proportion of those in the general population who are religious. And I think also the disparity or the size of the gap is important as well. So we see in particular that in France, in the United Kingdom, in the United States, there's a pretty big gap between the proportion of scientists who are religious and the proportion of people in the general population. So, and in Turkey. So in those national contexts, it might indeed be the case that dialogue is more difficult, especially in the United States, where there's quite a big gap there. In Hong Kong and Taiwan, something interesting. In Hong Kong, the proportion of scientists who is religious is greater than the proportion of those in the general population. And in Taiwan, that's the same. The proportion is different and the greater among scientists than in the general population. And these gaps are statistically significant. Happy to talk about that when we go to the question and answer. The second big point. So I'm going through, I have only 5 points. I had to whittle it down to 5 points. The book is over 300 pages with a huge methods appendix and all of our survey guides and everything. So the book is much more in depth if you want to get more deeply into these data and the main points we're trying to make. But here we're just I'm giving you a snapshot. So second, atheist scientists are more varied than we might think. So here's what I would call a blunt survey question. The extent to which the respondents believe there is no God. So we see that in France and the United Kingdom, that 51% and 40% of scientists respectively are convinced that there is no God. In France, even though we think of France as social sciences as a fairly secular society, only 17% of the general population is convinced that there is no God, 10% in the UK. The United States has quite a low proportion of convinced atheists, but a much different proportion than in the science community. In Hong Kong and Taiwan, again, we see the reverse, where in Hong Kong in particular, 55% of those in the general population are convinced that there is no God when compared to 26% of scientists. Italy, there's a big gap. Taiwan, there's the reverse as well. The gap is more, the magnitude of the difference is somewhat smaller, but still a reverse gap there as well. And you see India and Turkey there on the bottom. I think it's very interesting now to turn to the in-depth interviews that we did. On our team, we always do mixed methods of data collection, so surveys coupled with interviews and often observational work as well. So we did spend a lot of time traveling to these laboratories and research sites where scientists work to interview them in person and observe their context and how religion might play out, especially in their university context. So I'm going to turn to the interview data a bit to give a sense of some of the depth of these responses. So I'm going to present some interview data from 3 types of atheist scientists. So first, atheist scientists who see themselves as what one called modernist atheists, those who are convinced that there is no God, have no interaction with religious organizations, are not married or in a partnership with someone who's religious, are not raising their children religiously. They are thoroughly set apart from religious institutions and religious people generally. Here's a UK biologist who says this: so if religion is modern and if it's intelligent and conscious, then I think it's very beneficial. If it's irrational and hysterical and dogmatic, then I think it can be very dangerous and can block science. So there's within that quote, I think interestingly, a juxtaposition of religion that is not particularly problematic and religion that is difficult and can be actually dangerous to science. There's also a group of scientists who are atheists who think of themselves as spiritual atheists. And I wrote my first article on this topic in a journal called Sociology of Religion with Elizabeth Long, I think in 2011. So I've been thinking about this for a while. These are scientists who believe in something that's beyond themselves, have a sense of awe, often distinguish themselves from scientists who are not spiritual or modernist atheist scientists. So here's a quote from a US physicist who says this: "The spirituality part of it is why you do the work. I mean, I'm interested in understanding how the universe began, possibly what its long-term future is going to be. I think those are certainly spiritual questions." So this in particular physicist had a fairly expansive notion of spirituality and talked quite a while about the ways in which he thought spirituality and science were compatible actually with his atheism. There are also atheists that call themselves culturally religious atheists who have significant interface with religious institutions, often religious people who are sometimes married or partnered with someone who's religious, who are sometimes raising their children religiously. Here's a UK physicist who says, "I have no problem going to church services. It's like looking at another part of your culture, but I have no faith religiously, but it doesn't worry me that religion is still out there." So I'm out of time to discuss all of the ways that scientists who are atheists understand their atheism. There are a lot of different ways of understanding it. And one of the colleagues who wrote the book Secularity in Science with me, David Johnson, and I have a book coming out with Oxford next year called Varieties of Atheism in Science. So perhaps I can be so fortunate to have you invite me back to speak out that book at that point. But one of the most surprising findings actually from this study is just the kind of rich texture and varieties of atheism among the science community that there are in existence. So thirdly, most scientists do not see science and religion as conflicting. So when I give this information to religious communities, that's the thing that they think of as most surprising. There is really the belief in the general social world that scientists see science and religion as conflicting. So here's again, we measure this in different ways, but this is a blunt survey question. For me personally, my understanding of science and religion can be described as a relationship of and different choices. We also gave the choice conflict. I consider myself to be on the side of religion, but scientists were very unlikely to choose that, a really negligible proportion. Independence, they refer to different aspects of reality. So let me go back. Conflict, I consider myself to be on the side of science. Independence, they refer to different aspects of reality. And collaboration, each can be used to help support the other. So you see that generally speaking, independence is the most popular, with a high proportion in France actually, thinking that science and religion refer to different aspects of reality, a high proportion in Italy, in Taiwan, in the US. The minority, a minority proportion, but still a large minority in Hong Kong, in Turkey, in the UK, and in India. So here's what an independence perspective can look like when we turn to our in-depth interviews. Here's an Italian physicist who says this: no, there's no conflict. Science and religion are completely distinct because there is no connection between the physical reality described by science and the existence or not existence of God. Again, there's no intersection in the sense that science can explain. In other words, you will never be able to prove or disprove God. Science is outside the reach of God, rather, is outside the reach and the limits of science. Let's now turn to the collaboration view. So the idea that science and religion somehow can be used to support one another. There is a pretty significant minority of scientists who possess this view in Hong Kong, India, Taiwan, and Turkey. A much smaller proportion in France, Italy, the UK, and the US, but still not a negligible minority. So here's the collaboration view from a US biologist who says, for me personally, I don't experience a conflict. My religious side guides my hope for my professional work, and my professional work guides my openness to my religion. Religion also comes up in the scientific workforce, even for scientists who are not personally religious. And this too is something of a surprise in these data, and something that audiences that we have given this material to sometimes struggle with. So we're not saying that it necessarily should come up or that it has to come up, but what we are documenting through our interview, survey, and participation work is that it does come up in the scientific workplace. So here are some of the ways and reasons that religion comes up in the scientific workplace. It comes up through immigration. So the proportion of people who are migrants who travel in order to do scientific work, so the proportion who are immigrants or internationals, is quite large, especially in places like the US and the UK. In the UK, for example, as great a proportion as 30 to 40% of scientists who are internationals are immigrants, depending on the discipline or field of science. When people move to do scientific work, they bring their religious traditions with them. And so sometimes traditions that are minority traditions in the general population in a country, so as is the case with Islam in the UK, for example, can then show up in a larger way in a particular scientific discipline as a result of the types of people that are migrating to do that type of scientific work. Also through interaction with the public. So we saw when we looked at the differences in religiosity between scientists and the general population, that sometimes there is quite a big gap in the religiosity between scientists and members of the general population. And we find, though, that the public often needs, the scientists rather need the public for their scientific work, and then need to interact religiously with the public. And through ethics. Ethics is something that is a greater research interest of mine, and how scientists use different types of ethical understandings in their scientific work. And we found in this study that sometimes scientists appeal to religious forms of ethics, even to understand their scientific work, even if they are not personally, even if the scientist is not personally religious. We've written some about that on our team. So here's an article, and here's another article where we have some of that work if you're interested in that in more detail. So immigrants enter science and bring their religious traditions with them. Here's a quote from a French physicist who says this: "I had an interview with a Muslim girl who wants to apply to come here, so I did an interview with her through Skype. But then I could see that she was Muslim because she had the veil. We had a lab meeting, and then I said, okay, I interviewed this woman and stuff. She seems okay. And then I brought the issue that she was a Muslim with a veil. Some colleagues didn't want that in the lab. They think it will interfere with their work." So when we were interviewing this French physicist, he talked to us quite a bit about whether or not, we thought of this as discrimination, or he was concerned about this, but they ended up actually not hiring this woman in part because of her perceived religiosity and the impact it would have on science. We also see that religion comes up in interface with the public around two kinds of issues. In terms of the scientific work itself, especially when scientists are working with human subjects, they're doing research on people. And also it comes up in terms of scientific funding. So here's a UK biologist who says, "I work with food, and sometimes the research work would involve tasting or analyzing samples that may not be compatible with everyone's religious background. So if I knew that a number of my participants would prefer halal meat because that's what their religion sort of suggests, we would try to source halal and be clean about it, or we would offer the choice not to participate if they feel that the samples are not compatible with their religious views." So this is an example of a UK biologist who was using saliva samples for her particular research studies and was trying to be religiously sensitive in the public that she was interacting with. And then through ethics, providing ethical frameworks often for scientific work. Another biologist says religion provides a check for him on those occasions where you might be tempted to shortcut because you want to get something published and you think, oh, that experiment wasn't really good enough, but if I portray it in this way, then that will do. I'm going to talk about diversity in science for a moment, and this is something we talk a lot about in the US, and I know from interacting with scientific colleagues in the UK, this is an issue there as well. That religion, I want to argue, can be perhaps a part of racial and gender diversity in science. So here is just pulling out that US sample for a minute. This is the proportion of people present in science. And here's, you see that there's some gender disparity. So women in the US are a little over 50% of the US population, in biology 39%, and physics 17%. I should say here I'm pooling scientists in training, so PhD students or doctoral students all the way through those who have faculty positions. So as we go up the hierarchy in the science infrastructure, that number actually goes down quite a bit. Black scientists, those who identify as Black or African, are less than 2% in biology, and in physics, they're less than 1%. Hispanic scientists are about 5% of biologists and 2% of physicists, so pretty vastly underrepresented. Now we want to look at religion. This is the portion of US religious scientists compared to the US public, broken down according to quite broad, actually, tradition categories. So Protestant, and if we look at Protestantism and Catholicism and pool those together, there we see that there is 47% of the US scientists are see themselves as Catholic or Protestant. And when we turn to US scientists, we have a much lower proportion at 21% there. And then the none category is very interesting, where 61% of US scientists say they're not a part of a religious tradition, compared to about over 30% of the US population. I talk quite a bit about the general population and the general population's attitudes towards religion in this book. I'm not talking about today, Religion versus Science, What Religious People Really Think. And then the book that David kindly mentioned, Why Science and Faith Need Each Other, is more of a popular book looking at how scientific and religious communities can interact in productive ways. So here is gender, looking at the US religious scientists compared to the US public. And we see here that about 23% of women in the general US population are part of a Christian tradition. And in the US, we see that there's only 7% of the women among US scientists are part of a Christian tradition. So Christian women in general, in the general population, are much more likely to be religious than Christian men. There's quite a bit of data on that. One thing that I'm thinking about, so this is not something that our team has really published about, but something that we've been thinking a lot about, is if specifically for gender, that Christian women may be underrepresented in science in part because of motivations towards parenting and how parenting is shaped both in the scientific community and in religious communities. So for example, 39% of religious women in science have children, but 55% of religious men in science have children. I talk some about the tensions between parenting and science in this book, Failing Families, Failing Science, and in some other research that our team has done. So one of the factors in particular that may be influencing the underrepresentation of religious women in science is that these ideas about parenting, and perhaps the perception that science is not a place that's particularly friendly to families, and if one happens to have children and be a scientist, particularly for women. So just to say that a little bit more clearly, Christian women were particularly underrepresented in science, accounting for only 7% of scientists participating in our study. Whereas 88% in the context of their work. So Christian women, when they get into science, a high proportion of them report discrimination, including 26% because of their religion and 69% because of their gender. And those numbers are higher. I didn't put this up, but those numbers are higher than non-religious women. When we go to race, there's a little bit different picture emerges. So here we see that in the general population, about 79% of Black Americans see themselves as Christians. Among U.S. scientists, among the Black scientists, 64% see themselves as Christians. So the disparity between Black Americans in the general population and Black Americans and immigrants in science is not as great as what we see in gender. So that's interesting. Those who are other religion, who are Black, are 15%. So Black scientists tend to be quite religious when they actually enter science. Here's another table. So looking at the Protestant science, about 45% of Protestant scientists, of Black scientists are Protestant. And about 13% of white scientists are Protestant. So just another way of saying that Black scientists tend to be more religious than other racial groups of scientists. Those who have no religion are only 21% for Black scientists, and whereas 60% of white scientists say they have no religion. It's about the same among Hispanic scientists, although the proportion of Catholic scientists for Hispanics is quite a bit higher than for those who are white Catholics. So I want to talk for a moment about some other research that we've been doing through the Religion and Public Life program at Rice that may help us understand these religious and racial dynamics in U.S. science as related to diversity. So here's an interview I did with a Black scientist, a Black pastor in the U.S. who says this: a lot of what attracts people to science is seeing people that look like them. And so we don't see a lot of scientists that look like us or believe like us. And here's a Hispanic congregant who says Hispanics look at science as more of an Anglo field, so that their biggest fear is to step into that realm because they might be discriminated against, they might be looked down upon. And here's a pastor of a Black church who says this: I think trust is major for a lot of African American churches. When you talk about going into a context like science, we ask, what are you going to do with our kids? What's the outcome of this? What's really going to happen? Because we have been used to produce certain kinds of science experiments. So this pastor was talking in particular in this interview about the Tuskegee syphilis trials in the US, where the US government allowed Black men to continue to suffer from syphilis as part of experimentation. We've been used to produce certain kinds of science experiments that were not in our favor. We've been taken advantage of. Come to me with a nice package and a presentation, but there is an ulterior motive. And then another pastor of a Black church says this: science still for a lot of African Americans is a no trespassing zone. So one thing that we have been thinking about as we do research in this area is if religious organizations might be utilized as science outreach sites for underrepresented minorities in a US context. This is something which scientists themselves are quite skittish about when I present this material to them. But given the religiosity of Hispanic and Black Americans, but particularly Black Americans, and the ways in which religion is extremely important in their lives, this makes a good deal of sense. So we often in the scientific community broadly frame religion as a kind of problem for science, but I think that under certain conditions, it might hold possibilities. So here's a Black pastor again who says, we would be happy to have a scientist who's a Christian visit our church to talk about majoring in science for our college-bound seniors. And again, reminding you of the pastors who said it's important to see someone who looks like me and hear someone who believes like me. I just put up a final slide there about the research and outreach program at Rice University that I direct, the Religion and Public Life program. If you want to get regular updates about our research, please go ahead and contact us, or if you just want to look at our website about more of our research. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen and come back to the whole, and I think David will tell us what the next phase is. Thank you so much for your rapt attention. and really excited to hear more about how you're reflecting on this material and to answer your questions in a bit.
Thank you very much indeed. Absolutely fascinating. I'll tell you what I'm going to do, just also for your interest. I'm going to share a couple of tables from an Excel file of a survey of scientists and engineers and doctors that we commissioned to be done through Ipsos Mori in 2016. And we asked some of the very similar questions. So let me share that with you. And I think you'll find the statistics are very, sorry, I need to share screen. The statistics are very close to what you were looking at. So let me show you that. Share, okay. So I'll just move that down a little bit. So here you've got the question, which of the following best represents your view and about how they interact? And so you've got this is science and religion here. And so you've got, broadly, you've got 1,000 in each country, UK, France, Germany. And then you've got science and religion mutually exclusive, 25 UK, 21 France, 21 Germany. And then they're very much in line with your data, cannot be compared. In other words, the sort of NOMA position, non-overlapping magisteria, 44, 52, 47. So not huge difference there. And the almost identical, complementing each other, a low score in France, as you would expect. And then if I go on to the next panel, which is spirituality, then it's broadly the similar, but with higher complementarity figures, slightly higher complementarity figures. And then it breaks down into men, women, age groups, and so on. And in this survey, we also asked people about what sort of experiences they had. And so, for instance, in France, we asked if people had used any complementary medicine in the last 5 years. And even among atheists, 20% of them had used homeopathy. Whereas in the other countries, it would be 5%. So there's a huge amount of data there. And I'm very happy to send that through to you, for your sort of comparative purposes. But it reinforces, the sort of figures that you were looking at, that you were reporting yourself, which is this non-overlapping magisteria. Bernard, we'll come to you. Bernard is our president. He's an astrophysicist.
Yes. Thank you, Elaine. I noticed your survey was confined to physicists and biologists, and I was wondering why that was. And I mean, for example, it would have been interesting to look at psychologists, because I know in the context of psychical research, for example, David referred to this, there's a very different attitude from physicists and psychologists to psychical research. And it turns out that physicists are more open than psychologists to psychical research. So ironically, all the academic positions are in psychology departments. I mean, there have been 100 PhDs in parapsychology, and there are about 20 people who got academic positions. There's nobody in physics, who pushes parapsychology. I mean, I'm an exception. But so I wanted to ask you, what was the rationale for only asking physicists and biologists, and would you extend it to other disciplines as well?
So my first book on this topic, well, thank you for that question, firstly. My first book on this topic was published in 2010. So it's called Science versus Religion, What Scientists Really Think, and should have been called Science versus Religion or just Science and Religion. The press really wanted to hit home the conflict motif because, as we all know, conflict sells. And should have been called What Natural and Social Scientists Think. So for that book, I actually did study 7 different disciplines. When you do such a large international study, we want to cut down on variation to some extent. So if you think about, variation among national contexts and trying to compare general public to scientists, and then adding in different disciplines, we wanted to start out our research program cross-nationally, narrowing in on distance. And biology and physics make a great deal of sense for different historic relationships between religion and science. And there are different proportions of they're graphically quite different. And they are, chemists always come back to me and say, why not chemistry? And I think there's a very good rationale for including chemistry as well. But they are two disciplines which are widely present in all national contexts that have a developed science infrastructure. Psychology is not as widely present as a discipline, actually. So, there's a lot of conflict about whether or not psychology is a social science or a natural science now. There's a lot of different dynamics going on that I didn't want to study in this study. But there's certainly, because of those dynamics, psychology makes a great deal of sense for a different type of study. So that's a good point.
But are there other groups doing similar surveys who actually look at different disciplines just so it complements what you're doing? Or is it mainly
there's not very much research in this area. We are, not in particular, not in the scientific community. There's some research on bioethicists and biologists. So, comparing how those groups then view things like human reproductive genetic technologies, which is getting, of course, a lot of those sets of technologies are getting a lot of global play right now. I can't think off the top of my head of, studies that are done right now with a wider set of disciplines, social scientists of different disciplines.
Well, thank you very much. A very, very clear answer.
Thank you very much, Bernard. Well, I think we need to wind up now and let Elaine get on with the rest of her day, and then the rest of it is getting quite late. So I'd like to thank you very much for not only for the presentation, but also for the extremely thorough way that you've addressed the questions, because and nuanced as well, and based on these extensive conversations and interviews. And I was so interested that you said that it was an opportunity for these scientists to talk about these personal views that they didn't either have time or opportunity to do. And I found that a very interesting insight, and something regrettable. I mentioned the sort of high table at Oxford and Cambridge as an example of this. And I go to a conference on character and virtues in Oxford every year, and you get a bit of a flavour of that. And I spent a year at Christ College, Cambridge myself. So so this wider culture that obviously scientists are also part of is being more siloed from what you say, and people have less time to read, less time to think, and less time to have sort of more relaxed conversations over a dinner table, especially in these current circumstances. So we're reduced to Zoom. And my brother sent me something yesterday, which was a cartoon of Descartes, and it said, "Covido ergo Zoom," which is quite funny. So
I identify. Yes, I identify.
I'd like to thank you on behalf of all of us for your time and expertise, and I very much look forward to reading your next book, the varieties of atheism. I love that, the varieties of, and there's William James and other people, the varieties of, and so that will be a very interesting sort of nuanced treatment, I'm sure, of the theme. So on behalf of everybody here, thank you so much, Elaine.